In March 1945, Germany was standing on the edge of collapse. The front lines were falling apart. Supplies were running out. Soldiers were exhausted. And one fact hung over everything. The war would not end until the Allies crossed the Rhine. This river wasn't just a geographical obstacle. It was a symbolic line. A line behind which Germany could still rely on its last resources, its last forces, and maybe a chance to slow the inevitable. For years, the Germans had built defenses along the Rhine. They constructed fortifications, laid mines, set up artillery positions prepared to repel any crossing attempt. The Rhine was impassable to them, a fortress, a wall, the last hope. German military doctrine and soldier morale were built on the belief that the Allies could not quickly cross such a river. And this wasn't just confidence, it was faith. Faith that the Rhine would stop the enemy. But the Allies understood that in 1945 they couldn't afford a slow advance. The war was almost won, but Germany could still delay the Allies for weeks. And that could cost tens of thousands of lives. The question wasn't, could they cross? The question was, how fast? Traditional crossing methods, bridges, ferries, inflatable pontoons, were too slow. Bridges were destroyed. Ferries were vulnerable. Any attempt to move large forces across the river would mean massive losses and long delays. The Allies needed a solution that didn't just cross the river, it had to do it massively, quickly, and continuously. And that's when the DUKW, known as the Duck, entered the picture, an amphibious truck. But it wasn't just a vehicle, it was a symbol of how American industry could change the course of the war. The DUKW wasn't created over years. It was built in 38 days. It wasn't an experiment. It was a mass-produced tool. A total of 21,147 units were manufactured and deployed across the war theaters. This wasn't a novelty. It was a standard part of the Army, used in large numbers. Here's the key point. The Germans simply couldn't imagine the Allies pulling off such a crossing. They couldn't imagine thousands of trucks crossing the river, carrying soldiers, weapons, vehicles, and supplies. In their minds, the Rhine remained a barrier because they couldn't imagine an industry capable of producing such a massive number of amphibious trucks and using them like a highway. On March 23, 1945, Operation Plunder began. It wasn't just an attack. It was an attempt to turn the Rhine into a road. Allied artillery opened fire and about 4,000 guns unleashed a barrage on German positions. It wasn't just an assault on fortifications. It was a psychological blow. The Germans saw that the Allies were ready not just to attack, but to break through by sheer volume. And then the Ducks began doing what the Germans thought was impossible. They entered the water, crossed the river, reached the other bank, and kept moving as if the river was simply another lane of road. But this wasn't an isolated operation. It was a system. It was logistics turned into a weapon. The first hours of the crossing proved this wasn't luck. This was a new reality. The Ducks operated like a conveyor belt. They moved in columns, continuously, without stopping. Each duck could carry troops, cargo, and vehicles, then return for the next load. And the more of them there were, the faster the crossing became. In the first 24 hours, the Allies managed to move thousands of troops across the Rhine. But that was just the beginning. Over the next 48 hours, the Ducks turned the river into an uninterrupted logistics highway. Within 72 hours, 15,000 troops, 1,200 vehicles, and 3,000 tons of supplies had crossed. This wasn't a crossing. It was a massive redeployment of an army. The Germans watched this and couldn't understand what was happening. They saw their unbeatable river becoming a road. They saw the Allies not just breaking through, they were bypassing defenses. German intelligence couldn't explain where this speed and power came from. They couldn't imagine an industry capable of producing such a quantity of vehicles and using them simultaneously. This is where the main factor becomes clear. Modern warfare isn't decided only by strategy, it's decided by production capacity. Germany was strong in tactics and strategy, but it was exhausted. The United States was strong in production, and that became the key. Parallel to Operation Plunder was Operation Varsity, one of the largest airborne operations of World War II. 16,000 paratroopers were dropped behind German lines to secure the bridgehead and destroy the enemy's ability to counterattack. This wasn't just support. It was a decisive blow, ensuring the crossing would succeed, and that the Allies would hold the ground they seized and keep pushing forward. The Germans found themselves in a situation where their defense was being destroyed not only by firepower, but by speed. As the Allies secured the far bank, they were already able to advance deeper into Germany. The Rhine was no longer a barrier. It had become part of the route. On March 25th, Winston Churchill crossed the Rhine. It wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It was a message to the world and to Germany. The barrier is broken. The wall is down. We're moving forward. That crossing became historic because it showed that the Allies didn't just cross the river. They proved that Germany could no longer stop them. And now the crucial question, why did this shorten the war by 3 weeks? Because the Rhine was the last major natural barrier. If the Allies had not crossed it quickly, Germany could have regrouped, fortified, and built new defensive lines. That would have stretched the war for weeks, costing thousands more lives. But the Ducks made the impossible possible. They eliminated the Rhine's value as a defensive line. They made speed the primary weapon. As a result, the Allies continued their advance without interruption. And when German soldiers saw their unbeatable river turn into a road, they realized their last hope was disappearing. This was a moment when morale couldn't hold the defense, because now the enemy didn't just have numerical superiority. They had a technological advantage that allowed them to move forces faster than Germany could stop them. The DUKW was ugly and bulky. It wasn't graceful, but it was effective. It wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. It was a symbol of the fact that in war, victory doesn't always come from the battlefield. Sometimes it comes from factories. The Rhine became not a barrier, but a checkpoint. The Allies kept advancing. They pushed deeper into Germany, destroying communications, capturing cities, and crushing the remaining resistance. The German army could no longer stop them because speed was now against them. And when the war ended, many historians focused on battles and commanders' decisions. But the real turning point isn't always a battle. It's logistics, it's production, it's the ability to make the impossible possible. The DUKW didn't defeat Germany by itself, but it destroyed the meaning of its last line of defense. It turned the river into a road, a logistical bridge for the Allied army. And that's what accelerated the end of the war by 3 weeks. Because in the end, when speed and logistics decide the outcome, it's the factories, not the front lines, that determine the fate of the world. And in that sense, Detroit, not Berlin, was where the future of Europe was decided.